Mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples arranca agora e vamos abordar um tema que é absolutamente crucial no que diz respeito à atualidade internacional. Sim, vamos falar da Rússia e vamos falar de Vladimir Putin e explicar por que razão Putin não é assim tão simples. O convidado de hoje é Mark Galeotti, conceituado autor, orador e professor na University College of London, que se dedica a toda esta temática da Rússia e também, claro está, do seu incontornável líder. Um dos seus mais recentes livros é precisamente sobre Vladimir Putin e chama-se We Need to Talk About Putin, How the West Gets Him Wrong. Mark, it's an absolute pleasure to speak with you on our Foundation show, and the timing of this conversation is obviously crucial, taking into account the havoc that Mr. Vladimir Putin is wreaking not just in Ukraine but collaterally in international politics. First of all, I have to ask you, and especially since you wrote about Vladimir extensively in one of your recent books, exactly who is Vladimir Putin and what is he playing at right now?
Well, I mean, that's a question that could fill this entire segment. But
True.
I mean, put simply, I mean, this is a man who is a product of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's in some ways the last generation who really felt it as a visceral, emotional experience. You know, he was a kid from the back streets of Leningrad. He wasn't from an elite family or anything. He made it into the KGB. He thought that was it, that his future was secure. And then the whole system collapsed. And for him and for people like him, the experience of the end of empire, which, look, as any imperial country knows, can be hard, but nonetheless has metastasized from a sense of what have we lost to a sense of and who took it from us. And I think this is what we see. So that's the fundamentals. But then we've also got an additional overlay. The Putin we see today is really quite different from the Putin that we saw a couple of years ago. You know, he's no longer this cool, calm, managerial nationalist, undoubtedly, but very risk-averse leader. Something has changed. And I'll be honest, I don't know what it is. Some people claim that he's ill. Maybe it's just that he's getting older. Maybe it's just the distorting effects of being dictator of your country for 22 years, increasingly surrounding yourself with people who just simply agree with you, flatter your prejudices, and don't dare tell you when they think you're wrong. But one way or another, we now see a much more emotional, much more risk-taking old man in a hurry. And that's why he's, at the moment, so dangerous.
People have talked about Putin being a chess master, but in your book, you actually work to dispel that myth and say he's more like a judo fighter. What is that difference, and how would you describe him in his approach to how he works?
Well, look, exactly. I think there's this usual cliche of the Russians as the chess grandmasters, and they're playing chess while we're just playing checkers and so forth. The thing is, if you're playing chess at that level, you have this sort of long-term strategy. You know, you think, yes, I can do this and checkmate the opponent in 7 moves or whatever. There's absolutely no sign that Putin has that kind of long-term roadmap. He has a sense of where he'd like to be. But instead, like a judo fighter, he looks for opportunities. He tries to create dynamic situations where things go in different directions, and he can decide when the moment is right, which option to take. So again, you know, the judo fighter goes into the ring, you circle your opponent, and you wait for that opening. And that's very much the Putin approach. Create dynamic, often chaotic situations, which will give him lots of different options, and then as and when to decide. And the problem for us is that that's very difficult to predict. We're constantly looking for a grand plan when there isn't one. And the problem for him is that he seizes opportunities because today that looks like the good idea. But it may well be that next week it actually proves to be disastrous. And this is what we're seeing in Ukraine. He has gambled. And quite frankly, in my opinion, he has already lost that gamble. But what seems to have made sense to him at the time was not really thought through as long-term as it should have been.
As many ideas or projects as Vladimir Putin may have in his head, they're only as successful, especially in this case, as his military can make them. I know you've studied the Russian military in depth. What has been happening on the ground, and how different is that to what you would expect from one of the superpowers on the planet?
Now, that's a really interesting question, because exactly, we know that the Russian military has had a lot of money and a lot of time and political effort put into reforming it. I mean, it's been one of Putin's major projects. And until this war, the evidence was that it had been proving quite successful. I mean, if you look at, for example, the deployment into Syria, very different type of conflict. But still, it was one that a lot of outside observers thought Russia won't be able to pull this off. Or maybe they'll be able to start, but they won't be able to do it long term. And in fact, we've seen a very, very efficient, often very brutal, but very efficient military operation. In Ukraine, we have seen almost everything being done exactly the way that the military would not usually do it. Usually, the military would spend a long time building up carefully, planning every contingency and possibility. Then, when they attack, it will be a massive preliminary bombardment and then a very methodical advance. Instead, what we saw was a bit of a bombardment, but then these sort of strange little raids into the main cities, as if a couple of companies of paratroopers could just drive into the middle of Kyiv, arrest the government, and appoint a new one. And I think the answer to all of this is actually that this was very much Putin's strategy, Putin's idea. I mean, Putin, we know from his increasingly erratic speeches and statements on the subject, does not really believe Ukraine exists. He doesn't think it's a real country. He doesn't think the Ukrainians are a real people. And he clearly thought that the whole structure of the Ukrainian state would collapse at the first gentle push, which clearly has not been the case. But as a result of that, he basically imposed a plan on his generals that wasn't how they'd usually fight. It's gone disastrously wrong. And now there's clearly an attempt to try and regain the lost ground. And unfortunately, the way that is being regained is by the use of massive amounts of firepower. If we look at what's been happening to some of the sort of cities which have been in the line of attack, places like Mariupol, I mean, they are basically being blasted into rubble. And that is obviously an horrific strategy to use, but it's the one that the generals are using to try and regain the advantage after this mistaken initial strategy.
The longer this goes on, Mark, how important do you think it is for Putin to know that he still has internal support? And how much does that depend on his ability to control information and control the media?
Information control has been central to his rule for years now. For a long time, it was in some ways almost like a postmodern authoritarianism. It didn't depend on repression, on arrests, and on intimidation. It depended exactly on control of the narrative, in giving people a sense that change was either impossible or dangerous, and also a sense that whatever the flaws of the current situation, it was heading roughly in the right direction. Now, this is very much all changing. First of all, because after a certain point, the Kremlin lost control of the narrative. I mean, although now they've clamped down on the last vestiges of independent media, they've closed down a lot of social media channels, the Russians are actually quite technologically savvy. They know how to get around it. They know how to use VPNs to access these things. But also, look, they have had not years, not decades, but arguably centuries of being lied to by their leaders. And they're very, very adept at reading between the lines. And so I think what's happening at the moment is precisely that concern about losing control of the narrative, which is soon going to become even more serious as you start getting the first groups of soldiers coming home from the war. Because it's one thing to tell the Russian people that this is a limited military operation, surgically, precisely aimed to avoid civilian casualties, and it's purely about preventing a so-called neo-Nazi regime from attacking the Russians of the Donbass. The experience that the Russian soldiers are facing is very, very different. And when they go home, they will be bringing with them the knowledge of what's going on. So I think this is it. As the Kremlin loses control of the narrative, unfortunately, it has to fall back on, shall we say, old-fashioned authoritarian techniques. But in other words, we're going to see more use of policing and secret policing tactics.
Gotcha. Because I was honestly stunned when I saw video footage of that rally in Moscow with a full stadium of people of all ages. So it was not really just the older generation that may have been influenced by the control of information. I mean, it was really people who you would think would be able to have access to more, and they were still with him. And you're talking about tens of thousands of people. How long will they stick with him? And as life gets tougher as a result of the sanctions, and I'll ask you about that in a minute, how long is this possible for him to maintain?
I mean, I think it has a distinct shelf life. And even if we look at that rally at Luzhniki Stadium, we know, from their own accounts, that a lot of the people who were there were not there because they were enthusiastic, but they were there because they were told to do it. They were state employees, or in many cases, they were students at schools and universities who were told, oh, you have a day off, you're going to see a concert. And then they're bussed there, and then they find themselves at a Putin rally. On the other hand, yes, I mean, there clearly are people who are genuinely enthusiastic still. You can always find these people. The interesting question, though, is about that rally. Who was it for? Was it to try and convince the rest of the Russian public that, in fact, Putin was still popular? So in a way, people who are critical of Putin think, oh, I'll keep quiet because I'm in the minority. Was it Putin's attempt to actually convince the Russian elite that he uniquely can still get that kind of popular support, that none of them could possibly replace him? Or in some ways, was it a show that was really designed with an audience of one in mind, Putin himself, an attempt to try and allow the man himself to feel that he's still popular, something staged by his own officials? We really shouldn't put too much faith in the fact that the state can mobilize a crowd like this. They always can. In some ways, I think a much more telling insight is the fact of, I mean, there's more every day, but as of the last figure I saw, 18,000 Russians have already been arrested protesting against the war. And, this means something. Being arrested in Russia is a distinctly unpleasant experience. And they know they're going to be arrested, but still they go out and protest. This is very much, I would say, a situation in which the country is battling for its own soul.
Mark, I have to ask you, knowing him like you do and being aware of Russian politics and society and culture like you are, how do you get to him? How do you get to make him hurt or feel an impact of his actions? And let's talk about the sanctions, because I read and hear constant tales of how rich Putin is. So I would imagine none of this would really affect him. But what about the oligarchs? What about the people around him? Who's getting hurt here? And is he feeling a negative impact at all of what's happening from a sanction standpoint?
I mean, himself personally, I don't believe he is feeling the impact. I mean, this notion of his vast wealth, I think, was always overblown. Look, once upon a time, both before and in his early years as president, he was clearly on the make as much as anyone else. But these days, look, his real economic advantage is power. He has all of Russia as his piggy bank. If he wants a new palace, he doesn't have to spend a single ruble. Instead, he makes it known, and a whole collection of rich oligarchs and so forth realize that they had better all contribute to building that palace because their continued economic survival depends on that. So this is a thing. He's no longer someone who actually needs to worry about money. It's probably the only way in which he is like the Queen of England, in that he never has to carry money around with him. But more broadly, I mean, this is an interesting question because, look, the sanctions are clearly hitting already both rich Russians who are finding themselves losing all their assets abroad, and also very much ordinary Russians who very much already feeling the pinch and will feel it that much more. Now, what does Putin really care about? Does he care about the plight of an ordinary Russian? Honestly, I very much doubt it. What he cares about is firstly his political survival, secondly his position, shall I say, in history, because we know that he's thinking about his grand legacy, and thirdly he cares about success and failure. He does not want to be seen as a failure. So I think in these respects, sanctions all do have a very serious impact. First of all, in terms of survival, they slowly begin to create an environment in which people begin to think about whether or not he's dangerous to them. Remember, this is a system which essentially rewards efficient, ruthless pragmatists, people who frankly will do whatever it takes to become rich and powerful. And when you're riding high, that's a good thing, because these are the people who have an incentive to support you. On the other hand, when you begin to become dangerous to them, these are people who will have no loyalty to you. And I think this is the thing. There are very few people who are genuine loyalists to Putin. So it has an effect in terms of perhaps making him begin to worry. Secondly, it has an effect in terms of his place in history. Again, does he really want to be the Tsar who goes down in history as not only losing Ukraine, but actually also, creating misery for his own country? And thirdly, in terms of success or failure, he needs to feel that he has some kind of victories and some kind of successes. And if he feels he hasn't, then he will try and change the game. Now, the risk is he will try and escalate, but nonetheless, it will make him do something different. But the problem is that this is all a long-term process. And, in the modern world, we're used to everything happening quickly. Mm-hmm. We have our next day delivery and everything else. Well, unfortunately, none of this is quick. And therefore, in some ways, we're going to have to see how it plays out over the next few weeks and indeed months.
Really interesting point, actually, because in the age of immediate information and immediate resolution to most of our daily tasks and issues, we kind of expect a cycle like this to be a lot quicker. But we're only weeks into what is turning out to be a full-scale war. So before there's any kind of resolution, or at least a lack of escalation, it could take a while. And I wanted to ask you about the role of his allies in what could be a potential resolution. And obviously China comes up all the time, and the role it could play, not only from a political, geopolitical, but also from a financial standpoint. Where are Russia's allies right now? And could anybody have an ear of Putin for him to listen to any message or nudge?
Well, this is the interesting thing, and it must be such a depressing realization for Russia to come to terms with the fact that who are its real allies? Syria, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And then you're pretty much it. Because even China, despite the fact that there was this great deal made of the huge friendship between China and Russia, it really has become very clear the extent to which that was always an alliance of convenience, that they saw a common enemy in essentially the United States, and that they saw a common advantage in playing up their friendship. Because every time they did that, we in the West pay a lot of notice. However, it's worth mentioning that China hadn't even recognized the annexation of Crimea back in 2014, much to Russia's annoyance. And with this conflict, we see that China is deeply conflicted. It broadly feels that it can understand some of Russia's concerns about the expansion of NATO and generally the Western security architecture as a whole. But at the same time, first of all, it has invested very heavily in Ukraine. And also it consumes a large amount of Ukrainian agricultural products. Ukraine is the single largest supplier of corn, for example, to China. And that obviously is not happening now. So there are practical reasons why they're annoyed. Secondly, this is absolutely galvanizing the West and making the West much more unified. And it's interesting, if one looks at these economic sanctions, which are, it's worth noting, more unified, more powerful than anyone had imagined. I've spoken to people in government circles in both Britain and Washington, and they have been frankly amazed. They thought that they were going to be forced into making all kinds of concessions, but in fact, they feel that they got more than they expected in terms of sanctions. That's a worrying sign for China, because China had always assumed that when it came down to it, we in the West were just too fat, lazy, and hooked on our own convenience, that we would not be willing to actually prosecute economic war, which is basically what this is, when it was at our expense. when it cost us something. So I think from China's point of view, on the whole, this is a problem. But on the other hand, yes, they do have an opportunity. And I think this comes back to your point. There are some hints that the Chinese might be willing to step in as brokers of some kind of a peace deal. Mm-hmm. Firstly, because obviously they, more than anyone else, can actually hold the cudgel over Russia's head and say, look, you need to make concessions. We need to get this ended. Secondly, it is a slight sop to Vladimir Putin in that he can say, this was not the Western peace deal that was forced upon us. This was something that was arranged by good friends and allies, the Chinese. So it makes it seem as if it's less of a step down. So it's possible at the moment, but we're still basically waiting to see. I think, frankly, at the moment, the Chinese are still, more than anything else, just hoping this whole thing will just go away.
Well, that leads in perfectly to my next question regarding how this could all be sorted out in the end and what's Putin's end game and how he can negotiate from a position of weakness, which would never be in his wildest dreams, I guess, and then how he sells it as a victory internally to Russia and to Russians, which is obviously crucial for him. So what's the end game here? And if you were going to come up with maybe 2 or 3 solutions, how do you think this could play out?
Sure. I mean, the end game clearly has changed. His initial plan, his initial expectation was that Kyiv was going to fall within 2 days and the whole military operation would be over in 2 weeks, after which point a new puppet government will have been installed in Kyiv. Russian forces could largely be withdrawn, and he would have reconsolidated this notion that Ukraine is part of Russia's sphere of influence. Now, clearly, none of that's going to happen. The best he can hope for is either control of certain portions of Ukraine while fighting a vicious partisan war against the Ukrainians, or some kind of a peace deal that at least allows him to spin victory. And so this is, I think, the sort of the best case scenario, which is not ideal, but nonetheless is the likely probable best case, is precisely that he's able to make some kind of a deal with the Ukrainians, whereby the Ukrainians renounce their desire to seek NATO membership in return for certain security guarantees from Western countries. They essentially give Russia Crimea and the parts of the Donbass that have been fought over in the previous war, the so-called People's Republics. Because again, these are areas which frankly are already lost to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And in return, the Russians pull back. And the point is, for Putin, I mean, what he will presumably spin this as is, look, we always said this was not about invasion. This was about denazification, as he put it. A ridiculous claim, because Ukraine is not in any way a Nazi country. But nonetheless, he can say, look, we have demilitarized this country. We've blown up all these bases. We have forced the Ukrainians to agree that they weren't going to join NATO, which was our only real concern. And now we will go back, we will retrench, and we will focus on protecting the ethnic Russians and Russian speakers of the Southeast against Ukrainian oppression. Now, internationally speaking, everybody will know that that is essentially a defeat. But it's something that he can spin domestically as mission accomplished and just about gain that necessary sense that he's sort of salvaged some kind of a victory from defeat. Because although it very much feels wrong to be giving Putin anything after he has launched this ghastly, unprovoked and vicious invasion, nonetheless, if he feels that his only choices are between a military escalation and absolute surrender, then he will probably escalate. And we have to appreciate that Ukrainians will be paying the price for that. The point is, though, that, if you think of sanctions, I mean, presumably some sanctions would be lifted in those circumstances, but some would remain. And I think this is a key point we're going to make. There will be no forgive and forget moment. It is not as if we will ever return, while Putin is still in the Kremlin, to the situation that obtained just a month ago. And in some ways, what I feel is that we're going back to, almost like the 1970s, the era of the high Cold War. in which actually there will be a clear sense of a divide between Russia and the West. And for me, as someone who, very much is often visiting Russia, has great friends there, and is fascinated by the country, I think this is a tragedy for the Russians as well as for us. But I think that is really the best case we can hope for. The worst case is just a continuation of this war rolling across Ukraine.
And you mentioned escalation, and that'll be my last question. Is a nuclear war possible?
I'm always worried, and that pause alone is in some ways indicative.
Worrying.
I'm always worried about sort of saying, absolutely impossible at the moment, because, as I say, we are dealing with a different Putin, one who is much, much less predictable, and as I said, above all, one who seems to be taking risks that in the past he never would have. I think it is monstrously unlikely, not least because, as I say, ultimately the people around him are thinking of their own futures and such like. And I think if he was inclined to actually turn to nuclear weapons, instead of, as he is at the moment, every now and then kind of hinting and signaling, hoping that will scare us into backing away, I think there's a decent chance that even some of people in his own circle would either argue against him or just not obey orders. And I think that would be very, very dangerous for Putin personally. So on balance, I am pretty certain that it won't happen. And if it does happen, we'll be talking about a tactical nuclear strike within Ukraine intended to basically shock and awe the Ukrainians into resistance. I certainly don't think this will escalate into some sort of wider. This is not going to lead to World War III. But on the other hand, it is still one of the nightmares that we had thought we had put aside and that we're now having to revisit.
Mark, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We're going to close with just 4 quick-fire questions, which I'd like you to answer in one word or in one sentence. And these are more general ones, but obviously can be in your area of expertise. What is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having?
I think self-awareness.
And that goes back to what we've been talking about too. What is the biggest challenge you feel humanity is facing today?
Well, it fits in with climate change and everything else, but I think it is our inability to prepare for the crisis of tomorrow while we're wondering about what to do today. Yeah.
If you could change one thing in the world regarding international politics in your area, what would that be?
At the moment, I must admit, it would be Vladimir Putin disappearing mysteriously from the Kremlin.
And finally, what is the most important learning of your life and career that you'll take with you when you retire?
Every time I get something dramatically wrong, they're the most embarrassing moments, but they're the ones where you learn from.
Mark, thank you for your time. It's been incredibly insightful to hear you share your expertise on this subject, which of course is having a huge impact, not just now, but I'm sure it will in decades to come from every standpoint. So all the best, and I'm sure I'll be hearing and seeing you soon across various platforms around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Foi a conversa com o Mark Galeotti, e tão importante ter esta conversa sobre a Rússia e Vladimir Putin numa altura em que a guerra continua na Ucrânia e existe uma incerteza enorme relativamente ao futuro deste conflito e também da dinâmica das superpotências mundiais quando se aborda este homem e o impacto que pode ter também no futuro. Foi mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples.